Good evening, everyone. My name is William Ruger, and I'm the Vice President of Research and Policy at the Charles Koch Institute. And on behalf of the Institute, I'd like to welcome everyone here for this great panel on civil asset forfeiture. Now, it's really exciting for us to come here to New Hampshire, but especially for me as someone who was born and raised here in New Hampshire. I was born in Portsmouth, grew up in Plastow. Anyone from Plastow? Come on. So it's really exciting that we're here. Now, not everyone has probably heard of Charles Koch, right? Well, of course. Most people have heard of Charles Koch, particularly with his book Good Prophet out. But maybe few have heard of the institute that bears his name. So let me tell you just a little bit about that. The Charles Koch Institute, which is located in Arlington, Virginia, is an educational foundation that focuses on the importance of freedom to individual and societal well-being. We're not partisan, we're not political, we're educational, but we're interested in issues like civil asset forfeiture that really directly impact people's flourishing as human beings and our flourishing as just societies. Now you might ask yourself, well, why is this Arlington group coming up to New Hampshire? Well, for Granite Staters like us, right, every 4 years people seem to come up here for some reason. But that's not why we're here. Why we're here is because New Hampshire is a place that has a long history and tradition of respecting individual rights and individual liberties. And people like you are keen to protect those liberties for yourselves, for your kids, and for your grandchildren. And to really kind of live by that notion of live free or die, right? If I had some wine, I'd raise it to it. So we thought this would be a great venue to kind of further the national conversation that's already happening across the country on civil asset forfeiture in particular, but criminal justice and policing reform in general. And so we thought it'd be just great to bring up a wonderful panel with an excellent moderator to really talk through this issue in an educational fashion, in a non-partisan, non-political fashion, so that we have the best ideas out there in order to realize liberty and flourishing in our lifetime. Now, who are the speakers up here? Well, the first is Gilles Bissonnette, who's the legal director for the American Civil Liberties Union of New Hampshire. Now, while at the ACLU, Gilles has regularly litigated cases in state and federal court addressing voting rights, free speech, access to justice for indigent defendants, and criminal justice reform. Prior to joining the ACLU, Gilles was a litigator in Boston, where he focused on commercial litigation, free speech, and data privacy. He's clerked for Judge Thomas Golden of the U.S. District Court, and he was the chief editor of the UCLA Law Review, where he received his JD. Our next participant, our panelist, is Rob Piccola. He's an attorney with the Institute for Justice. He litigates cases promoting economic liberty, free speech, and property rights, and he is part of a team challenging Philadelphia's civil asset forfeiture program in federal court. Prior to joining IJ, Rob was a trial attorney with the international law firm Duane Morris, and he was also a law clerk for the Honorable Sally Adkins of the Court of Appeals of Maryland and the Honorable Jacqueline Wynn of the U.S. District Court. He received his law degree from George Washington University Law School in Washington. I should know this next guy since he works for the Charles Koch Institute. Vikrant Reddy, he's a senior research fellow at the Charles Koch Institute, a great colleague. I love having him there every day. Vikrant previously served as senior policy analyst at the Center for Effective Justice at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is one of the great state-level policy foundations in the country, led by the wonderful Brooke Rollins. He managed the launch of TPPF's Right on Crime, which has had a great impact in our country. Vikrant graduated from the University of Texas at Austin, and he earned his law degree at Southern Methodist University. And last but certainly not least, he hardly needs mentioning, is one of America's greatest journalists, John Stossel. So I'm old enough that I remember when John was on a great show called 2020 and did some of the best reporting out there at a time where it was hard to find that kind of stuff. But now he hosts Stossel, a weekly Fox Business program that covers consumer issues from a libertarian viewpoint. His first shows covered global warming, the food police, licensing rules, the healthcare business, all the good things, gambling, guns, but also bad things, lawsuit abuse, income inequality, and entrepreneurs under attack. He's the author of No, They Can't, Why Government Fails But Individuals Succeed. Prior to joining Fox Business News, Stossel co-anchored ABC's Primetime News Magazine 2020, and he was a consumer reporter for Good Morning America. And John has won 19 Emmy Awards, which is just an amazing record. So we're very lucky to have John with us. So thank you very much, and take it away. Thank you, John.
All right, let's get right down to it. I'm impressed that you're here because looking at the topic, civil justice forfeiture. This was proposed to me as an idea for my TV show, and I said, nobody cares. Nobody can understand what it is even. And you want to talk about criminal justice reform, okay, police, SWAT teams, police abuse, I get that, but civil justice reform. So what turned my head around was the work done by this law firm which defends people who have their stuff taken, the Institute for Justice, and some of the stories they tell. So Rob, you defend these people. Why don't you start with a couple examples?
Well, John, your point is well taken, and we have a joke around the office that there are two kinds of people. There are people who loathe asset forfeiture, and there's people who don't know about it. And the people that we represent are really emblematic of the kind of issues that people face when encountering this morass of forfeiture on a daily basis. And one story I have is particularly salient for folks in New Hampshire because there's a purported heroin epidemic in New Hampshire, which is oftentimes a justification for the kinds of forfeiture policies that we're going to be talking about today. And the family I'd like to talk about is a family we represent, the Sorabellis family in Philadelphia. And like so many families, sadly, they have a son with a heroin problem who they've tried to support and bolster through this horrible family tragedy. And unbeknownst to them, he sold about $40 worth of drugs outside of their home. Well, after that arrest, rather than going through a normal criminal process, they found that the police arrived, locked them out of their home, kept them out homeless for more than a week, and then tried to get them to enter a stipulation that they would not let their recovering addict son back in their home under government penalty. Now that's the kind of story about what asset forfeiture really does to people who are struggling with drug problems and who are suffering from these detrimental things that can happen within a family. And civil forfeiture, rather than helping, curbing, stemming, makes the problem worse.
But what was forfeited? I thought you were going to say they came in the house and took the family's money.
They took the house.
Okay, that's well put. The police, by and large, mean well. I hear your side of that story. I would imagine the prosecution would say, I can't imagine what they would say, but they're not just cruel people.
You know, this really isn't about good cops or bad cops. It's about good incentives versus bad incentives. And the problem with civil forfeiture is that once that house, that cash, the car, whatever, is taken and goes through the forfeiture process, the proceeds at the end of the day go back to law enforcement. So when officers are out there, there is this cornucopia of possible assets that are there for the taking. And that incentive is what drives people. And, you know, I really don't like to make this about good or bad law enforcement officers. It's about the incentives. And I guess George Eliot put it best in the 19th century, that the devil tempts us not. It's we who tempt him, beckoning his skill with opportunity. And asset forfeiture is that opportunity.
How many events do you attend and hear quotes like that? Giles, bring it from Philadelphia to New Hampshire.
Well, the incentives that Rob is talking about exist here in New Hampshire under New Hampshire's state asset forfeiture law. And to kind of...
Which is similar to other states,
It is
right?
similar to other states. So for example, when a seizure takes place and then ultimately property is forfeited, 45% of those funds, they go to the local law enforcement agency that initially performed the seizure. The other 45% go to a drug forfeiture fund that's held in trust by the Attorney General's office, and then the State Attorney General's office issues grants from that fund to local law enforcement, and then the remaining 10% is allocated for drug treatment at the Department of Health and Human Services. So, I mean, these same incentives that Rob's talking about in Philadelphia and that exist in other states happen here. And not only do I think we have this incentive problem in New Hampshire, but we just have a system that is out of whack. It is possible in New Hampshire under the current way the statute is drafted to actually have property forfeited through a civil procedure, through a civil case, before an individual is actually formally convicted of a crime. And that to me is just crazy, right? It's putting the cart before the horse. If the state wants to claim that certain property that you have in your possession is linked to criminal activity, I mean, they should have to prove that you committed a crime first. But right now, unfortunately, in New Hampshire, as in other states, we have a two-track system. You're charged with the crime, potentially, and then, concurrent with that, the state is initiating a civil procedure, a civil asset forfeiture procedure, a proceeding, by the way, where you were not entitled to an attorney. It's a civil proceeding. And so there's some great work being done in New Hampshire right now to reform.
You're allowed to hire an attorney.
Well,
just not here.
John's right. You're allowed to hire an attorney, but you are not, if you can't afford one, if you are too poor to afford one, you are not entitled to have one appointed to you at government expense, unlike a criminal case, where if you're too poor, you can have representation. So we have a real problem in New Hampshire. There's a great reform effort. Representative McGuire is here in the front row, who's led that reform effort. And that bill just passed the New Hampshire House of Representatives. It was close. And for reasons that we can get into later as to why it was close, it's heading to the Senate, and we all have our fingers crossed as to.
Is the reason that it's close because the police say, look, these drug criminals have operations everywhere. If we can't take their stuff, they're just going to get away with it.
Well, I'll tell you what the police say. I have their letter right here from the New Hampshire Association of the Chiefs of Police to the committee that was considering this at the time. Taking away these funds would cripple our ability to put any drug sales cases together, and with the huge drug issues we are facing, the timing of this is alarming for all of law enforcement. And so, listen.
And this audience laughs because you're really knowledgeable, but I would say that would make sense to most people.
It does have some appeal, but listen, even if one is to assume that the opioid crisis in New Hampshire is real and should be addressed, and there's a lot of political movement in that direction. We have a drug task force that's working on reform efforts right now. But should the funding to address this problem come from law enforcement activities or through the legislative democratic process? If law enforcement thinks they need monies to address a real problem that they think exists, go to the legislature like everyone else and make your pitch. Argue why these funds are necessary. Because when you have, if you are not going through that process and instead are policing for profit, it just, I think, has tremendous consequences. There's an accountability problem. Who are those law enforcement accountable to? They're now no longer accountable to the democratic process. There's not a lot of transparency, by the way, in how these officers use these funds to begin with. And I think there's also an impressions problem, right? So I think the Democratic sponsor, or one of the Democrats who supported this bill, and this was a bipartisan effort in New Hampshire, I think said it best. It is important for the public to perceive and believe that police are acting solely on the needs of law enforcement and not for purposes of their own revenue enhancement. And I think that is so true. And one of the reasons why, if you think this is a real problem, go through the democratic process. Don't fund your own activities through policing.
Now, the funding, some of it comes from state work and confiscating in the state, but most of the money now comes from the feds. We have a distribution system, but the Justice Department has just announced we're not going to give all this money to states, partly because of protests from people like you. So, Vikrant, let me ask you, since you have the misfortune of not living in New Hampshire or Texas anymore, but being in D.C., reading about that, it sounds like it's solved.
Yeah, this was a interesting story, broke just before Christmas, and a lot of people are under the misapprehension that this issue has been solved because of this big DOJ announcement. So right before Christmas, the announcement was made that their equitable sharing program was going to be halted. Now, equitable sharing means that they incentivize the states to go and do these things because the states are allowed to keep a portion of the money, the feds keep a portion of the money, everybody is happy. But DOJ said, shortly before Christmas, we're going to halt this program.
Which in New Hampshire was about $1 million a year.
$1 million a year. And by the way, the proceeds from this program have increased dramatically since the turn of the century. I think I read that from 2000 to 2008, equitable sharing proceeds have doubled from 200 million to 400 million. I mean, this is, it goes back to what Rob said about the incentive problems that exist here. You have all the incentive in the world to do these awful things. Until this past December when DOJ said they were going to stop doing this. But I think there are two things to remember about this. Number one, interestingly, the reason that DOJ said they would stop doing this is because they said they didn't have the funding for the program anymore. Not because they thought it was a terrible thing to do, not because they said, gosh, the government really ought to stop doing this, but they've temporarily halted it. But then the second thing, and
I'm sorry, I am confused. I thought they self-fund from what they confiscate.
You would think so. They apparently don't have the upfront funds for the beginning infrastructure that's needed. They said they had a funding problem. So they've stopped it for that reason. But it's a very important point. They were clear in the memo that they fought very hard to find some way to preserve the program, and yet they were unable to do so. But the second thing, and this is the really important thing that I want people to remember, is that the Department of Justice, under the leadership of the Attorney General or the President, they can take any number of actions anytime. They can reverse those actions anytime. You can get a new administration in place. They can do what they're going to do. These things are fleeting. What you need is for Congress to actually pass a law. That is more powerful than, as the President says, a pen and a phone. When you have Congress actually passing laws that help, I was going to say reduce the incentive problem, but really eliminate the incentive problem would be better.
You mean Congress and state legislatures?
Congress and state legislatures. That's an important point also. We shouldn't think that just because the problem is solved in Washington, D.C., it's solved. Actually, you've still got a problem across the 50 states. But you need legislative action, and people should not think that just because you read some memo in the newspaper from DOJ that you don't have a civil asset forfeiture issue in the country.
And I just have one comment on that. I mean, one of the things that I'm hearing is that with the federal equitable sharing program at least temporarily halted, whether or not asset forfeiture now is going to kind of move back into the states that may have just frankly bad laws that have all of these incentive problems. And that, who knows, very well could happen here in New Hampshire if our own state reform efforts don't pass. I think it just highlights why we need reform here as well.
Rob, how about another example or two, people you're defending?
It really runs the sort of factual scenario with money, cars, cash. One example was a gentleman we represent, Charles Clark, who was moving. His mother was a veteran, and together they were going from one house to another. Drug dogs sniffed his luggage at the airport. He had his entire life savings with him. And based on no finding of any drugs or any criminal activity or any sort of underlying misconduct, they stole his entire life savings right there. Sorry, I should say. They seized. But in all seriousness, that's an ongoing case where we're representing him, trying to get his money back, especially where there's no, when you hear about asset forfeiture, one of the things that I think you brought up was, well, if the criminals are doing this or the people charged with the crime are doing that, well, so often in asset forfeiture, the property owner has never been charged with any crime. And oftentimes, especially in the context of our client who was at an airport, there was not even a warrant. There was no judicial due process at all. And bam, the money's gone.
How much money?
$11,000.
And why can't he, I mean, the Institute for Justice takes these cases for nothing. Can't people just sue to get it back? You have no evidence against me.
Well, it's expensive to hire a lawyer. We can't represent everyone. We would if we could.
Would cost much more than $11,000.
Well, and it goes to an important sort of tactic that law enforcement often uses, which is to go after those smaller amounts. And just to sort of bring this home to New Hampshire, there's a policy here with the U.S. Attorney where they're permitted to have amounts of, say, $2,000 be subject to this policy. Oftentimes at the federal level and with these joint task forces, they'll say maybe $10,000 minimum, $20,000 minimum. Those are cases which are going to be the path of most resistance where people are going to fight to get their money back. If you are seizing those smaller amounts of money, the odds of having the resources or the drive or the expertise to fight it in court are much smaller. So it's a real problem with people not having the resources to get their day in court.
You know what, I want to follow up on another point, Rob, that I think it's a little technical, but it's so important. You know, these the law enforcement agents will seize your property, and they have to think that it was involved in a crime in some way. Well, how sure do they have to be? The language that lawyers use is they have to feel that by a preponderance of the evidence. So that means more or less 51% sure that this is tainted money, tainted property on some level. But when you go to get it back, very frequently, it is not a preponderance of the evidence standard. It's a clear and convincing evidence standard. It's much harder. That's a higher standard. I mean, it's hard to kind of put numbers on this, but that's more like a 70, 80, 90% sure. So you have to demonstrate at that level, and the burden's on you, by the way, that it was not tainted property. But that's not what the law enforcement agents have to demonstrate it by. And one important fix would be making sure that these levels are equalized, that law enforcement perhaps has to demonstrate by clear and convincing evidence, or that your level could be lowered to just preponderance of the evidence.
Well, and preferably that it's not your burden at all. I mean, you should never have to prove that your money is your money.
Even better.
So what happened in this case? The guy says, I'm moving. This is my life savings. Why are these officers assuming he's a criminal? They must have had something.
Well, unfortunately, it's part of a much larger pattern. When you look at cash seizures, there were 68,000 in an approximate 10-year period, and that accounted for billions of dollars in property that were taken. No warrant, no due process. And so it's just one story out of many where there's these, what they call either highway interdictions on the road when you get pulled over or at the airport, places where you don't have any due process on the front end and your cash is gone.
If you have a lot of cash in certain places, they assume you're a crook.
Exactly. It's so almost like a war on our cash economy in some ways, because there is this presumption, and it is true in the law enforcement world that a large amount of cash can be seen as a reason alone of suspicion. So it's a real problem with people who, and they're perfectly within their right to do this, carry cash.
And Vikram, tell about the study in Tennessee.
Oh yeah, this is one of my favorite, I hate to say favorite, and it's so terrifying, actually. So there's this study that I read about out of Tennessee. It's out of Tennessee, but I have no doubt that it would be replicated if you were to do this in Texas or Arizona, California. There's a highway that goes out of Tennessee, runs east-west. So if you drive down this highway, it goes towards Mexico. Now, on the westbound side of the highway, money is traveling, and on the eastbound side of the highway, drugs are traveling, right? Because the drugs come up from Central America, Mexico, South America. Now, if law enforcement was really interested in catching the drugs, the majority of law enforcement agents would be positioned with their radar guns and things on the eastbound side of the highway. Or, you know, you'd find that it was 50-50, half on one side, half on the other. It'd be very unusual if a large percentage were actually on the westbound side of the highway. And yet the study showed that 80% of the time, the officers position themselves on the other side of the highway. Why? Because if they're on the drug side, what do you get when you seize the property? You just get the drugs. But if you're on...
Plus the car.
Plus the car. But on the other side, you get the money, you get the cash. And it's that incentive problem again.
And I think it's a real sort of call to be aware. You know, we're here in New Hampshire where there's this purported heroin epidemic. You know, it might behoove all of us to pay attention when you're on 95. Which side of the street are you seeing the officers on? It's just a question to ask yourself, because we have to be mindful of these things, unfortunately.
Let me push the other side. This was originally used to deprive smugglers and pirates of their ill-gotten gains, I'm told. Police now say the smugglers and pirates of yore today are the drug runners, just as hard to catch and convict, given that the kingpins reside often in another country. Forfeiture is the tool to hit these drug dealers where it hurts most, their wallets.
Everyone is against this. There's no heroin lobby. The only people who support who support civil asset forfeiture are the law enforcement who are making money from it. And you're right, there was.
Well, they say they're putting bad guys out of business.
Well, they say that. Let's go back to 1984. Yes, 1984. There are reverberations of that Orwellian year to this day. And that was when Congress amended the Drug Abuse and Prevention Act. And instead of having forfeiture funds go back into the general treasury, you have them going back to law enforcement. Well, right after that, you had about $93 million in the forfeiture fund. Last year alone, $4.4 billion went in. So you are right. There has been a historical change, and that it was originally a very limited source of curbing activity from certain kingpins, but all of the empirical evidence universally says that the explosion is directly linked to the profit that comes from it, not to the prevention of crime.
And Giles, explain the difference why it's better if you're going to do this at all, it's less evil if it goes to the state treasury rather than to that department's budget. Okay, the department says we got to fund ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's an incentive to look harder.
You know, we can have civil asset forfeiture reform and still provide resources to law enforcement to, fight criminal activities. That's why I think go through the legislative process rather than, as I said before, fund police action through police action. To me, I just think for all the reasons that have been discussed before, it creates a set of really wrong incentives, and I think even worse, creates an accountability problem. I think law enforcement, just like other government agencies, government employees, need to be accountable to the democratic process and to the public. And we've seen, even in New Hampshire, there's been one instance of a real lack of accountability. I think, for a lot of you probably heard of the Jim Reams kind of scandal in Rockingham County. One of the allegations that was made against him, actually by the state attorney general's office, was that he was commingling alcohol fines with federal equitable sharing proceeds that they were getting from the federal government through asset forfeiture. And then essentially he was using that as a slush fund to fund, outings to Hawaii and to San Diego for professional development. Now, those are just allegations, but, if true, that's really serious, and I think, again, highlights one of the problems with having a system like this that doesn't go through the normal democratic appropriation process where citizens are given the opportunity to comment. And lastly, again, civil asset forfeiture won't hinder law enforcement's efforts. If you are going to say, if law enforcement is going to say, we want to put the bad guys away and take their ill-gotten gains, I think what reformers say appropriately is, prove it. Prove that they committed a crime. And if you do that, and then you can also show that that property has a nexus to that criminal activity, then you can take that property away. But that's providing due process. So I don't think anyone here would claim that ill-gotten gains, it would be appropriate for criminals to hold on to it. I think that what we're all saying is provide due process, and then following due process, if criminal activity is there and if the property has a nexus to it, then it's appropriate.
So just one, some of us libertarians would say it ought to be legal.
I don't want to
They
speak.
sold it.
That's
They should
fair.
keep it.
That's fair.
But Vikram, the Koch Institute specializes in markets and incentives. So elaborate on the incentive point about if it goes to the Treasury or if it goes to the department.
Well, so, we were talking about this beforehand, and I was saying, think of it this way. Let's assume that you, John, are told that if you go and see some ill-gotten gains, you get to bring it back to this room, and what we'll do is find some politician to determine a way to distribute it amongst all of us. Or, suppose that I tell you that if you go and get some ill-gotten gains, you, John Stossel, get to keep all of it. I think you are much more interested in that latter option than the former option. So when the officers are told, you get to keep what you find, they will very aggressively go out there, get the money so they can keep it to, well, I don't think we've dug into some of these examples yet, but they're so comical. There was a police department that bought a snowmobile. There was one guy who used asset forfeiture funds to pay off, I think, a child's student loans. There's an example in Texas of a police department that bought a margarita machine with the funds. Now, I'm from Texas, and I rarely criticize people for having margaritas, but this was beyond the pale.
Well, and that goes to what Gilles was talking about transparency. Who here in this room would like to know what your government in New Hampshire is doing with forfeiture proceeds? Okay, well, if you go look it up, the Washington Post has compiled it for you. Guess what the #1 category is? Other. So, there's just no transparency whatsoever. And it's part of the problem. We have a resource for this. I hate to plug, but it's all free. At the Institute for Justice, we have a guide for all 50 states called Policing for Profit. And it's also available online, ij.org. And this is a great place where you can go to find out how these numbers bear out, not only in New Hampshire, but all different parts of the country where these different violations of people's civil liberties are happening.
And when you get the drug forfeiture fund reports from the Attorney General's office here in New Hampshire, similarly, there's just no itemization. You get statements like this. This is basically the only page articulating where drug forfeiture funds monies go in a given year, and it just says a $19,000 grant was given to the Berlin Police Department. The remaining expenses, $35,000, are reimbursements to law enforcement agencies for drug forfeiture cases and expenses at the New Hampshire Attorney General's Drugs Task Force, period. That's it. That's all we have.
There's a large conversation, if you take a step back, about policing across America right now. And a lot of you are familiar with some of these really notorious stories. They don't necessarily deal with asset forfeiture, but let me tell you how it ties in. You remember Eric Garner, the man who was selling loose cigarettes in Staten Island? He was put in the chokehold. He ended up dying. There's this kind of over-criminalization issue, the sorts of things that police are going after people for. Everybody remembers the incident in Ferguson, of course.
But just to break that down, if the taxes were highest in the nation in New York, there wouldn't be any legal business selling untaxed cigarettes. And then how much police action do you need to stop that?
I agree with that, and I often think that, I generally almost always think that the problem is more with the policymakers and the laws that they are passing rather than with the police officers. They're going out there and enforcing dreadful laws. But another issue I want to talk briefly about Ferguson. One of the interesting things that came out of the Department of Justice report is whatever happened in the individual incident there, and it does seem like the police officer has largely been exonerated. Many people in the city of Ferguson were upset by the fact that the police department was funding itself by writing all sorts of tickets for people on all kinds of trivial things. So you look at this ticketing issue, you look at this over-criminalization issue, and now you look at civil asset forfeiture. And what you have is a developing problem where Americans increasingly have an antagonistic relationship towards police officers. That is very unhealthy. That's not the kind of relationship we should have with law enforcement. We should have trust and faith in the rule of law. But asset forfeiture is part of this series of things that are eroding that.
And since other was the big category, let me just give a couple examples from elsewhere. In Los Angeles, the cops bought themselves a $5 million helicopter with some of the money. In Reminderville, Ohio, they got $225, which they spent on a clown. And it shows the thinking. The police chief, Jeff Buck, defended the purchase. He said it was meant to improve relations between the community and the police.
There you go. That's
The money I
answer.
spent on Sparkles the Clown is a very minute portion of the money I spend in the war on drugs. All right, but on the other hand, more reasonably from the cops, assuming that property should deserve the same set of rights as an individual in court isn't logical.
No,
That's what one police officer said in defending this.
it is never an individual's burden to come in and show the government why they own their property. Especially when it's been taken from them. The idea that because there is some whiff of suspicion that you immediately lose your due process rights and that your property takes on this bizarre. And by the way, look at some of the case names in asset forfeiture. They are crazy. United States versus a 1989 blue Mercury. United States versus $183,000 cash. Now that's what's illogical. I mean, that makes no sense whatsoever. Those are individuals' property, so there's no sort of support logically for the idea that money gets no process.
All right, here's the commander of New Hampshire's State Police Narcotics and Investigations Unit, John Encarnacio. In some parts of the country, law enforcement's abused the process. I've seen it, but I have not seen it here in New Hampshire. And a New Hampshire state representative, if this bill passes, it means the drug enforcement of the state on opioids and other things will be greatly reduced. The money is not going to be available. And is this why that the bill is controversial? It's the money?
Yeah. But at the end of the day, we're actually only talking about $50,000 to $60,000 per year in New Hampshire. We're not talking about a huge amount of money. It will not.
Most of the money has been coming from the Fed.
Yes, exactly. This is not going to be crippling. I think a lot of it, frankly, is hyperbolic. But yes, John, that's really been the central pushback we've received so far.
And I don't know if this has come up yet, but it also prevents a big separation of powers issue where the police are out there, essentially functionaries of the executive, self-funding their own departments. That's not their job. They have no business funding a penny of their budgets. It should all come from the legislature. So the fact that any of it is coming from their own forfeiture revenues has some real constitutional issues.
The FBI says many criminals are motivated by greed. No kidding. And the acquisition of material goods. Therefore, the ability of government to forfeit property connected with criminal activity is an effective law enforcement tool by reducing the incentive for illegal conduct. Asset forfeiture takes the profit out of crime.
Do we have any evidence of that? Or this is just an assertion?
Well, it's a good question. Is there any evidence that this works?
No, I mean, if they were, in Vikram's example, if they really cared about the way crime operates, they would cut it off at the stem by being on the side of the road where the drugs are coming in. They would be there. The fact that you are going after these profits after the fact show, if anything, a complete disinterest in what's actually happening to people who are struggling with addiction or with crime. It's completely responsive and does nothing to prevent it.
And you could still take away the profits from crime, but just provide due process first, period.
But it takes so long because you lawyers are so slow.
That's true. I have no response to that.
Well, don't worry, they're not entitled to lawyers.
That's true.
That's true.
The FBI again. These funds can be used then to compensate innocent victims. Much time and effort is expended in such cases to ensure that the wrongdoer's assets are preserved pending trial, so they remain available for victims.
It's the government's burden to show that something is evidence. Again, it's the government's job when making their case at trial to show what is or isn't material and what may need to be kept. But there's no reason that there should be a presumption that they get to just keep it.
Have any states done things that are the model for the country on this, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think so. The first thing I would note is, IJ puts out this terrific report, which they recently updated, Policing for Profit. And
Institute for Justice is IJ.
if I remember correctly, 2 of the states in that report that actually have decent grades and they got Bs are Vermont and Maine. They're right near New Hampshire. It's kind of embarrassing that New Hampshire would be left out there. But more recently, a lot of states have kind of stepped forward to take a look at their civil asset forfeiture problems. Just at the end of last year, Michigan passed a very important bill, which, first of all, this is basic stuff that any state ought to be doing. They just strengthened their reporting requirements. They wanted to get a better sense of what is being taken, who is it being taken from, where is this money going, what is it being spent on. It's incredible how little we actually know about that in many jurisdictions. That should be an easy push. But you could go even further. Michigan has done a lot to reduce the incentive problem that we've talked about. New Mexico actually went the furthest of all. I think they're kind of the iconic example of what you ought to be doing. They have eliminated that incentive problem. The money goes into a general fund now. The officers do not keep it. That's profoundly important. I would say, if nothing else, if you got that done in every state in America, that would go a long way in solving the problem.
Well, on that note, why don't we open it up to you? If you have questions or comments, that there are people from the Institute with microphones. Why don't you just pick who you're near and who you want to give a microphone to? You're in charge now.
Thanks very much.
This is the man who wrote the bill?
Yeah, I helped, actually. It turned out the bill we submitted and the bill that passed were completely different. The committee replaced it completely, and for political reasons, we let a Democrat write it, even though we Republicans are in the majority. But he maintained the goals of the bill, and so that was the important thing. Anyways, I wanted to ask about, there were 2 numbers mentioned that I wanted to compare. One was that there's $4.4 billion worth of asset forfeiture annually in the United States. I think that's what you said. And my understanding, by the way, is that that's greater than the total amount of all burglaries in the United States. So it's just incredible. But the other one was that equitable sharing was only $400 million a year. So 400 million versus 4.4 billion total. So equitable sharing is only 10%. I had thought that equitable sharing was 90%. So what's the difference?
Well, it depends on the numbers that you're looking at. Equitable sharing is one component of equitable sharing within itself has 2 components. One is adoptions, and in adoptions, the state officials basically hand over what they have to the feds and then are able to take the spoils from it. With Joint Task Force, which is 78%, and this may be the number you're thinking of, is in New Hampshire, 78% of the money, that $1 million or so, comes in from the feds in equitable sharing, but not from adoption. And I know this all gets a little sort of...
And he said $4 billion, a long way from that to these...
Well, so that's what comes in from the Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Fund. So that's looking at the federal level of everything that comes in.
So most stays with the Treasury?
No, it goes out. All of that goes back to whether it's from the Treasury's fund or whether it's from the Department of Justice's fund, which is total, both in the billions, goes back to law enforcement. In terms of the numbers of equitable sharing, I think it is higher than that, and I would have to pull those numbers, but they're extremely high. And for many, like for New Hampshire, I mean, the comparison, you think about this maybe 50, at tops $100,000 a year in forfeitures coming from your state statute, whereas it's more than $1 million from the sharing with the feds. So the demonstrations can be pretty dramatic when it comes to the proportion.
Yes? It sounds like it's not so equitable sharing, but
So in New Hampshire, the vast majority of forfeitures are done by the federal government. And my understanding is that, and maybe I'm wrong, so correct me if I am, that the DOJ does not want to give equitable sharing funds to states that have relatively strict asset forfeiture procedures, in particular if those revenues go to the state general fund. They will only release equitable sharing to police departments. At least that's my understanding. So would this bill that's up for consideration also affect the equitable sharing side, especially the adoptions that the federal government does of state cases?
Well, right now there's a moratorium on adoptions. It's been temporarily stopped. Of course, it could start up again with the stroke of a pen, so that's not really in the mix. And my understanding of the legislation considered in New Hampshire right now is that it doesn't close that equitable sharing loophole. So that's, a big public policy thing that is of concern in New Hampshire.
Hi, earlier.
and, why don't you say your name so your neighbors get to know you there?
Thank you. My name's Kevin Bloom, and I was a volunteer with the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance and worked on the asset forfeiture with Lee McGrath and Dan McGuire and everyone else who worked on it, who are too numerous to mention. But during testimony in the hearings for the asset forfeiture reform bill, law enforcement said, first of all, we never do that. And then they said, but if you make us stop, we'll lose a lot of money. So Jill mentioned that $60,000 number. Don't believe it for a minute. We don't think they're being straight up as far as their numbers go. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Mateus. I just have one question. Who defends the inanimate objects in court?
I guess we all at some point have defended inanimate objects in court.
So the way that I understand the process to work, there's in New Hampshire at least a petition filed by the Attorney General's office concerning the amount of property that was seized, and here's where you get the crazy names that Rob was talking about: in re $1,500, in re 1993 Acura. And then it's really incumbent upon the individual who claims an ownership interest then to enter an appearance in the case and essentially make a claim to that property and then argue that number one, I didn't commit a crime, or two, even if I did, that property is wholly unrelated to it. So the person would come in, hopefully they're represented, maybe they're not, and oftentimes, unfortunately, in New Hampshire, they simply default. They don't even contest it. Why? Because there could be all host of reasons. They have to hire a lawyer. There could be strategic reasons. They're dealing with a pending criminal case, and they may not want to defend themselves in two separate actions because defending themselves in the civil case could have consequences in the criminal case. So that's generally how the process works. If the civil case is not stayed pending the adjudication in criminal court, which sometimes does happen.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Carla. I just wanted to follow up on Kevin's point. To be gracious, we all know cash does corrupt people. And so I was curious if any studies have been done, and perhaps if they haven't been done, if this is something that might be pursued over time. What, if anything, and I'm going to assume it's something, is being underreported or skimmed off the top? And a suggestion to the gentleman from CKI who said New Mexico is an iconic example where the money is now going into the general fund. Maybe an easy place to start is to do a comparison between what is being now sent to the general fund as what was being sent originally to police departments. And I think that would be an interesting study over time.
Yeah, I think that would be an interesting study. And, it would probably have to be a study moving forward, because looking back, I don't think we have any really good examples of states that, in our views, would be doing asset forfeiture correctly right now. Even the states that I'd mentioned, like...
It's so recent.
It's so recent, yeah. I'd said that in the IJ report, Vermont and Maine were given good grades. Even they were only given Bs. I don't think anybody got an A.
New Mexico did.
In the update now, New Mexico has an A, yeah,
And
but it's
so-
very recent.
And I will say that New Mexico, the city of Albuquerque, is trying to wiggle its way out from even this new law passed saying, well, it doesn't apply to these municipal forfeitures. And so we're suing them, representing 2 state senators who passed the bill. And stay tuned.
And since you say you're suing them, I want to apologize to you, because when your organization was being formed, I said to your boss, are you kidding me? You're going to solve problems with more lawsuits? You lawyers are wrecking everything already. But in this case, I was wrong, and you guys do great work. Yes.
I read in an article
What's your name?
Andrew Cashone, and I read in an article that the IRS was using it directly now. How big a percentage of this problem is direct federal agencies using it for their own budget, and do we even know those figures?
So the IRS, I mentioned those 2 funds, and they have the Treasury Forfeiture Fund that they put their money into. And there's a bizarre practice in IRS forfeitures called structuring. Right. So imagine you have a small business and you consistently make deposits of $10,000 or less. We have clients, a woman named Carol Hinders in Iowa who had a little taco shop, and so, of course she's putting in lots of small cash deposits. Well, some bureaucrat in the IRS is watching that and says, aha, this is a sign of criminal activity, because that's what drug dealers do. And so they can freeze your assets just based on those small deposits alone, which is a really scary thing that the IRS is now saying. And again, we've had so many of these in the past year. I know we were talking about this beforehand, where a government agency will say, well, we're going to back off from that. But of course, with a stroke of a pen, they could resume again, and they carve out exceptions for themselves. But you make a good point, which is that it's not just the Department of Justice, and it's not just the state police enforcement. It's also government agencies, and particularly the IRS, who are self-funding by engaging in that kind of forfeiture.
Hello, thank you guys for coming out. That's really wonderful. My name's Jim Gordon, and I have a question. The states that have better grades, B, A, even C's, have they seen a lowering of the burden of civil asset forfeiture on the general populace?
It's so soon after this report was just released. It's our 2nd edition, and so that kind of long-term empirical evidence isn't there yet. But, it's regardless of what the results are, when you abolish civil forfeiture and replace it with criminal forfeiture, you have done a great constitutional good in the world. And so that alone, I think, is worthy of us being happy. But we'll, of course, keep tracking them and keep very close tabs on how that plays out in the real world going forward.
I bet when they do the study, they'll say, yeah, there's much less money now, but there's much less drug trafficking now. Is the gentleman in the corner over there?
Rick Humboldt. I just would like to make a recommendation. Perhaps we should suggest that police departments all across the country change their motto from "we serve and protect" to "we make money the real old-fashioned way. We steal it."
But many of us are angry about abuses by the police. But in most cases, don't you think the cops who are taking this money really think they have reason to think this person is doing something illegal? I was asking the panel.
But that's the problem. Short of going to a psychic, a spiritualist, a mind reader, a tarot card, you'll never know.
That's the thing, John. I mean, assume you're right. Assume that police officers have a genuine good faith suspicion that this is tainted money. That's not enough, not in America. and certainly not in a state that has live free or die on its license plate. That's not enough.
Hi, my name is Jen Coffey. I don't know where in the Constitution it says that you can take a person's property under the idea that they might have done something wrong. Has there been any efforts to bring this to the Supreme Court and put an end to the fact that we are taking away people's property with no trial, no conviction, no crime? Like the young man that was in the train station that lost all of his money for college. Why is that being allowed, and where is the challenge in the federal government?
Well, we have a federal case right now, a class action suing the city of Philadelphia for their civil asset forfeiture program. And we're attacking it from every angle, everything from their policy of doing what are called seizures and seals, where they go in without giving the person a chance to have their side of the story in court and then get an order basically sealing off the house. So we actually got them to stop that policy. They entered a consent decree that's being monitored by the court now, and you can find out more about that on our website. But the lawsuit continues, and we are trying to get part of the forfeiture sort of system struck down on constitutional grounds, particularly the profit incentive, which is still pending in the district court in Philadelphia, and it's something we plan on fighting as high and as far as we can.
Hello, I'm Tony Lekis. Actually, I've supported IJ for a long time, and my wife and I were plaintiffs in a different matter for IJ at one time.
Oh, we'll
thank you for what you do.
Afterward. Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
He's not Santa Claus?
I
got a list.
I have been accused of being the big fat home invader in the red outfit. No, there's the question raised about motive, and do the police really believe that they're doing the right thing? And the problem with bad incentives is that people are very good, especially over time, at in effect fooling themselves. Right. I mean, it may be that they really believe that. I tend to believe that there's some of them so corrupt that they know what they're doing and that they're basically committing banditry. But it's a corrupting influence over the long run on the police, just like any incentive to commit something wrong.
I think that's such a good point, because it's really important not to disparage law enforcement. I mean, they are doing a hard job. They have very dangerous jobs, and I think many of us have encountered a time where we've needed them for something to keep us safe. The problem is bad incentives, and you put any person in front of a bad incentive day after day after day after day, and that's where the problem is. So, yeah, we never want to disparage individuals. It's about the incentives that are motivating them.
I think this goes back to the point that Vicar made before, which is, and all the concerns we're hearing in this room, I think highlights why reform is necessary. This system creates distrust, whether it's actual or apparent. So, let's kind of put an end to it and create a more transparent regime where we can all go about our business and have more trust and confidence in the system. And that process will be provided if we ever have an encounter with law enforcement and our properties involved.
Hi, my name is Ian Underwood. I'd like to ask Jen's question from a slightly different direction, and that is, I'm wondering if you can cite any Supreme Court, appeals court cases where the justices have said that this somehow does not violate the Fifth Amendment protection against having your property taken from you without due process, and how they tap danced around that contradiction.
Crimstock probably is the most.
Do you want to give the?
We can each go. Well, no, we'll each give our. You can go. There is the Supreme Court, of course, has not squarely come down on the exact issues that we're talking about, but Justice Sotomayor actually, before she became Supreme Court justice, wrote an opinion, Crimstock versus Kelly, in the Second Circuit, where it did get into the rights that you have. And in fact, there is even nomenclature for it now about a Crimstock hearing, which is where you can actually show up and have your day in court to contest the seizure of your property. So there are advancements being made, and I think similar to the kind of panels, whether it's the ACLU or Common Cause or heritage or whatever the spectrum is, I think it's oftentimes the same way within the jurisprudential world, that I have a lot of optimism on this issue.
So I think what some of our opponents would say is, well, wait a second, there actually is process, right? You know, this is just hyperbole, you know? There's a civil process, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, the government, you know, files a petition in court after your property's been seized, and you go to court, there's a judge, and, you know, you make your case. But I think for all the reasons we've already addressed, it's just not sufficient. It doesn't provide enough process. You know, a criminal conviction isn't necessarily required. If you're indigent, you don't have a right to counsel in that civil proceeding. And I think, you know, as all of these examples that Rob has talked about demonstrate, you know, it's the government versus you. And really all the tools are on the government side, and they really just can bludgeon you, unfortunately.
Hey, I'm Charles Spangler, and I was just curious, based on your experience in, excuse me, with lawsuits and research and everything else you've done, what percentage of cases would you say are regarding asset forfeiture are either directly or indirectly related to drug prohibition laws?
Let me guess, 90%.
It's really, I don't have the precise number at my fingertips, but it's really high. And in fact, that's getting back to the Philadelphia class action. It's almost all, primarily, not entirely, but centered around their Controlled Substances Forfeiture Act, because it is just such a, and in fact, the dates I was giving earlier about that 1984, well, look when that was, as the drug war was picking up steam and just really pummeling a lot of civil liberties, and asset forfeiture is sadly one of them. So your observation is right, that it is close as pages in a book to the drug war.
And the number that I've been using, 50 to 60,000 in New Hampshire, is pure drug-related forfeiture. How much is taken through, we have actually a separate statutory regime, how much is taken through that process for non-drug-related criminal activities? I don't know if I know the answer to that at all. So it's a great question.
We are running out of time, so this will be our last question.
Hi, my name is Bill Walker. I think a lot of this is a symptom, not actually a problem of what happens, and the problem is that we've lost touch with a lot of the founding principles in our country. It's a constitutional republic, not a democracy. I'm really starting to get aggravated with that word being bandied about. One of the problems is that a lot of people think that it really doesn't matter what your rights are, we can vote you out of them. And if we want your stuff, we can vote in order to take it, if we don't like who you are or what you think or what you've done with your money or your property. I think that as much as a lot of people try and pay lip service to the respect of either the people or the office that they hold, the simple fact of the matter is it's become a lot more realistic and profitable not to buy off judges and police and politicians. It's to become them. And that is where the real power for the criminals is to become the people who dictate what the law is. Because things are only criminal activity when the legislators deem it so. And they also deem it that it's a loophole for anybody in their job as a law enforcement officer no longer have to follow the rules that all of the rest of us have to follow. And most of the things that we declare laws aren't laws. They're rules and they're regulations. They're not based on moral principles. They're not based on having a victim. They're simply based on somebody in power not liking who you are or what you do.
It's a great way to end, and it's a good point. We're a constitutional republic. They do say democracy all the time, which if you think about it just means 51% could boss the rest of us around. Imagine if a supermarket was decided that way. If the majority wants fish, we all have to eat fish. So we are a constitutional republic. I thank the Charles Koch Institute for reminding us of that, and we'll have another great event tomorrow, which will will tell us about here in this room.
Great. I want to thank all of the panelists and especially John for doing an incredible job moderating the panel.